Okay, so let's get to some of this data that you've been able to compile, this dashboard as well, and obviously the statistics, which are a bit alarming. Can you just speak to a bit to the mental health situation going right now on in the New York State prisons and what you found from that?
Yes, so today we released a data dashboard that specifically looks at incidents of suicide, suicide attempts, and self-harm. We also released a second dashboard that looks at people who are on the mental health caseload in the state prisons. Right, the two big takeaways from that data is one, that the number of suicides have doubled from 2023 to 2024. It is actually a pretty significant increase when looking at the average number each year. And then the second piece is, and this is a trend that we've seen for a few years now, is that there's more incarcerated individuals who are on what's called a mental health caseload, meaning they're receiving mental health services from the Office of Mental Health and other professionals in state prisons.
Do you see a reason for this? What do is there any way you can kind of correlate that to a situation going on or what's happening inside the prisons right now?
Well, so separating it out, right, it's hard to say what the reason is for the increase in the number of suicides in state prisons without understanding the circumstances and specifics of each cases. Taking a look at the data, we did come away with a few interesting takeaways in the sense that a larger number of the deaths by suicide in 2024 versus prior years are happening in the disciplinary units. So those are the regional mental health units, those are the SHU or special housing units, and the RRO units, which are the rehabilitative units that were created, after the passage of the HALT Act. Right, seeing that there's been an increase in those units specifically and a larger number of deaths by suicide in those units tells us that, right, there are people who are already under a sense of duress, who are in distress in different ways, who are unable to receive right access to out of cell time or other types of treatment, which could be driving this increase in the number of suicides.
I think when people look at staffing inside prisons, and obviously that's been a big topic for months now, they look at, when it comes to violence or whatever you might want to say, but it feels like it also has an impact here, right? When it comes to those mental health units of being able to have the individual person, whether that's an officer, whether that's a mental health court, whatever it's going to be able to provide care. Does that play into this too, to not have the people to be able to keep it, to help at this point, to provide those services?
Yeah, well, right, there's civilian staff who provides mental health services, and that's definitely one component where, right, you have less program staff, less counselors, less mental health staff at large in the prisons. But you also have a large amount of people who you have a dearth of security staff at some of the prisons, and one particularly difficult stat that we saw in all of this data is the vast majority of these deaths by suicide are happening by hanging, meaning that right, if you're thinking about right, this happening right in a prison, it leading to needing like an immediate response from staff on site. So when you're hearing and seeing in the data that there's a larger number of people who are dying by suicide by hanging themselves in state prisons, it calls into question why there isn't a faster response right from staff on the ground, especially if it's happening in disciplinary units and units where people with a severe mental illness are incarcerated.
Did you see any correlation to certain facilities, certain times of year, anything of that nature?
Well, in our dashboard, we do have the numbers by facility. So I encourage folks to check that out. Two facilities that did stand out were Coxsackie and also Marcy, and both of those facilities are home to regional mental health units, which are disciplinary units for people with severe mental illness.
Yeah, and like we just spoke about a bit, the Marcy, and obviously there's some calls for closure after what happened with Robert Brooks. One of the reasons that docs said that, it was important to keep it open was that mental health unit. That does play a role here, right? And Marcy, obviously, as we know, we've heard stories from there, right? I guess how does that for you, how does that sit at this point?
Yeah, well, we actually had the chance to conduct a monitoring visit to Marcy a few weeks ago, earlier in July. And when we were at Marcy, we did spend a good amount of time in the RMHU, which is the unit that you just mentioned. And there were many individuals who were seeking to get more out of cell time, get more human contact, be able to access programs, be able to start the process of becoming better and rehabilitating. And right, not only was that not happening at the moment or happening very minimally at the moment when we were there, but it's not limited to Marcy in a sense, right? Because of what has the officer work stoppage and the current ongoing um, purported suspension of the HALT law. There are people who are in cells, in disciplinary units, and other housing units who just aren't getting access to academic, vocational programs, and also counseling and access to mental health support. So yes, it's exacerbating the condition, and you could see that clearly. In the data that we released today.
What does docs need to do to reverse these trends?
Well, right. It's one thing that's on the table for docs right now are up to 3 prison closures that were authorized in the state budget. And right, that could be one tool to consolidate staff to where staff is needed. Right, a lot of these prisons are located across the street from each other, and they 2 prisons across the street from each other both have staffing shortages. Right, it begs the question of why right staff isn't being consolidated in one area. Another thing is making sure that right what is supposed to be happening is happening in practice in the prisons. And right, the omnibus bill that just passed the legislature and is in the hands of the governor actually creates a number of accountability mechanisms and mechanisms towards transparency that would allow folks to know when things are going in the wrong direction and hold people accountable who are responsible for those things going in the wrong direction. So I'd say there's 2 components to it, right? Having enough people on the ground to respond to incidences where there is a suicide attempt or an incident of self-harm before it leads to a death. And then the second part of it is holding folks accountable who aren't doing the right thing, who might not be responding as quickly. This didn't happen right in the state prisons, but a few weeks ago there was a lot of press around an incident at Rikers where there was an individual who was committing self-harm and there wasn't a fast enough response. And even when there was when the staff responded at Rikers, right, they didn't enter the cell until the person had passed away or had become unconscious. So right, just making sure that one, that there's enough people, and two, that those people are doing the right thing when these incidents occur. Could go a long way towards decreasing the number and percentage increase that we've seen in deaths by suicide and deaths overall in state prisons.
Have you heard of any movement in terms of the prison closures? The budget was passed in May, and it was a part of that. And that's been something I've been curious, wondering if this is, I mean, it's August, and the governor has until December, I guess you could say, or I guess until the next fiscal year begins, you could say in April. But, in terms of what that timeline looks like for all, the transparency, those bills too, like this is something that's happening now, right? And I feel like there's got to be some urgency here.
Well, the closures are generally announced later in the year,
Okay.
so I imagine that right, that announcement will come later in the year from the governor. It actually has to happen by the end of the year because they have a 90-day notice that they must provide before the next fiscal year starts. Also, on the omnibus bill, right, it hasn't we haven't heard a lot of information about it. The governor can request that the bill gets sent to her from the legislature, which would start the countdown clock. But yeah, I mean, to your point, sooner rather than later, so these things could come into effect and come to fruition would be